January 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The air hung thick with smoke and the acrid scent of cordite. Dawn had not yet broken over the rice paddies of central Luzon, but the darkness was alive with sound. The metallic chatter of machine gun fire, the dull crump of mortar rounds finding earth, the shouted orders in Japanese echoing across no man's land. In a shallow foxhole carved into the volcanic soil, Private First Class Tony Stein crouched with his hands wrapped around a weapon that should not have existed. It was a makeshift thing, cobbled together from the parts of a downed aircraft's machine gun, fitted with a crude stock and an improvised trigger mechanism. The weapon had no official designation, no serial number stamped into its receiver. The Marines who watched him work simply called it the Stinger. Stein's hands moved with mechanical precision in the pre-dawn gloom. Eject the empty magazine, retrieve a loaded one from the canvas bag at his feet, slam it home, charge the bolt, acquire target, fire. The rhythm was hypnotic, unceasing, a metronome keeping time with death itself. Around him, the men of Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, lay pressed into the earth, their rifles clutched tight, their eyes wide with the particular terror that comes when you realize the enemy has you surrounded, and the only thing standing between survival and annihilation is one man and his impossible weapon. This was not how the liberation of the Philippines was supposed to unfold. When American forces returned to the Philippine archipelago in October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur stood in the surf at Leyte and declared before newsreel cameras that he had fulfilled his promise. "I have returned," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy and vindication. But Luzon was not Leyte. Luzon was where the Japanese had decided to make their stand. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the conqueror of Singapore, the man they called the Tiger of Malaya, had withdrawn his forces into the mountainous interior of Luzon with a singular purpose: to bleed the Americans white. He commanded over 260,000 troops, and he had no intention of surrendering. The Imperial Japanese Army had learned from its failures at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Saipan. No more suicidal banzai charges into American machine gun fire. Instead, Yamashita would dig in, fortify, and force the Americans to pay in blood for every mile of ground. By January 1945, the 28th Marines had been fighting continuously for 17 days. They had landed at Lingayen Gulf on January 9th, wading through surf stained red with the blood of men who had stepped on submerged mines or caught sniper fire before reaching the beach. They had pushed inland through a landscape that seemed designed by a malevolent god, swamps that swallowed men whole, forests where every tree might hide a Japanese soldier waiting with a grenade. Hills honeycombed with tunnels and bunkers interconnected in ways that made conventional assault suicidal. Tony Stein had arrived in this hell, carrying a weapon that weighed 30 pounds unloaded and fired .50 caliber rounds at a rate of 800 rounds per minute. He had built it himself, or rather he had convinced a Navy mechanic to help him salvage the machine gun from a wrecked Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber and modify it for ground use. Stein was a toolmaker by trade, a kid from Dayton, Ohio, who had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1942 with a high school diploma and a gift for understanding how machines worked. He looked at the twin .50 caliber machine guns mounted in the Avenger's turret and saw not aircraft armament, but infantry support weapons waiting to be born. The Marines' armory had plenty of Browning automatic rifles, plenty of M1 Garands, even a decent supply of .30 caliber machine guns. What it did not have was anything that could lay down the kind of sustained, overwhelming firepower needed to suppress a well-entrenched enemy while your squad maneuvered. Stein had watched too many good men die, trying to rush Japanese positions with rifles that fired 8 rounds before needing a reload. He wanted something that would make the enemy keep their heads down, something that would give his brothers a fighting chance. So he built the Stinger, and he carried it into combat, and the Japanese learned to fear the sound of it. But weapons, even extraordinary ones, are only as effective as the ammunition supply permits. A 50 caliber machine gun eats through bullets the way a wildfire consumes dry grass, voraciously, undiscriminately. Each belt contained 100 rounds, and Stein could empty a belt in 7.5 seconds if he held the trigger down. Every bullet had to be transported across thousands of miles of ocean, offloaded on beaches under fire, hauled through jungle and swamp by men who were already carrying their own rifles, rations, and water. Supply lines were fragile things, easily disrupted by enemy action or simple logistical chaos. On the morning of January 23, 1945, Tony Stein's company found itself cut off. They had been advancing to a ridge designated on maps as Hill 362, moving through terrain that offered no cover, just open rice paddies checkered with low dikes and the occasional copse of palm trees. Intelligence had reported light enemy presence. Intelligence, as usual, had been catastrophically wrong. The Japanese had concealed an entire battalion in tunnels and spider holes scattered across the approach to the hill, and when Company A reached the killing zone, they opened fire from 3 sides simultaneously. Men fell in the first seconds of the ambush, cut down before they could even identify where the firing was coming from. The survivors dove for cover that did not exist, pressing themselves into shallow depressions in the earth while bullets churned the air above them. Officers shouted for smoke, for covering fire, for anything that might break the enemy's momentum. But the Japanese had planned their ambush with methodical precision. Every likely position for American machine guns was already pre-registered for mortar fire. Every route of retreat was covered by interlocking fields of fire from concealed bunkers. Company A had walked into a trap designed to annihilate them. Tony Stein did not dive for cover. He ran forward. It was an insane thing to do, the kind of decision that separates Medal of Honor recipients from corpses by the thinnest of margins. Stein sprinted toward the nearest Japanese position with the Stinger braced against his hip, firing from the waist as he moved. The 50 caliber rounds tore through the woven bamboo and sandbags of the enemy bunker as though they were paper. Japanese soldiers tumbled backward, their weapons falling silent. Stein did not stop. He charged the next position, then the next, laying down fire so intense, so unrelenting, that the enemy soldiers who survived the initial bursts abandoned their posts and retreated deeper into the tunnel network. For the Marines pinned in the rice paddy, Stein's assault bought them seconds, then minutes, enough time to organize, to find cover, to begin returning fire. But seconds and minutes were meaningless without ammunition, and Stein's 50 caliber machine gun was devouring bullets at a rate that would exhaust Stein's supply in less than an hour of sustained combat. He carried 8 belts slung across his shoulders and stuffed into the canvas bag at his feet. 800 rounds. It sounded like a lot until you did the mathematics of survival. Stein made a calculation that would define the rest of the battle. He would fire until his ammunition dry curry. Then he would run back to the company's original position, nearly 250 yards across open ground under enemy fire, retrieve more ammunition, and return to the fight. He would repeat this as many times as necessary until either the enemy was suppressed or he was dead. The men who survived that day would later struggle to articulate what they witnessed. It was not courage exactly, though it required courage of an almost incomprehensible magnitude. It was not tactical brilliance, though Stein's understanding of fields of fire and suppression techniques was sophisticated beyond his rank. What they witnessed was something closer to transformation, a man converting himself into a machine of salvation, subordinating every human instinct for self-preservation to the singular purpose of keeping his brothers alive. Stein made the first run back for ammunition after 20 minutes. He slung the Stinger across his back. It was too heavy to carry while sprinting, too valuable to abandon, and ran. Japanese riflemen tracked his movement, bullets kicking up dirt around his boots, sniper rounds cracking past his head close enough to feel the pressure wave. He reached the ammunition dump, grabbed 4 more belts, and ran back the way he had come, still under fire, still untouched. The Marines watching from the rice paddy could not believe he was alive. He reloaded the Stinger without taking cover, standing fully exposed while his hands performed the familiar sequence: open feed tray, lay belt across receiver, close tray, charge bolt, fire. The Japanese bunkers that had begun to stir back to life fell silent again under the renewed barrage. 15 minutes later, he made the run again. Then again. Then again. Historians who later studied the action at Hill 362 counted 8 separate ammunition runs across that 250-yard stretch of kill zone. 8 times Tony Stein exposed himself to concentrated enemy fire. 8 times he returned with enough ammunition to continue the suppression. The Japanese commander in charge of the defense must have recognized what was happening, that a single American with an improvised weapon was systematically dismantling a carefully prepared ambush, because by the 4th run, the enemy began concentrating fire specifically on Stein. Machine guns swiveled to track his movement, mortars walked their fire across his route, snipers were repositioned to cover his expected path. Stein varied his route each time, sprinting in unpredictable patterns, using what little cover existed, a slight rise in the ground here, a shattered palm stump there, but variation only reduced risk, it could not eliminate it. On the 6th run, a bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through uniform fabric and skin without hitting bone. He kept running. On the 7th, a mortar round landed close enough to lift him off his feet and slam him into the earth, ears ringing, vision blurred. He got up and kept running. The company commander, Captain Thomas Witherspoon, later testified that he had ordered Stein to stop after the 5th ammunition run. The order was ignored. Witherspoon repeated the order after the 6th run, this time as a direct command. Stein acknowledged the order and made the 7th run anyway. When Witherspoon confronted him about insubordination, Stein's response was simple: "Sir, they'll die if I stop." It was not bravado, it was mathematics. Company A had suffered 30% casualties in the first hour of the ambush. Without continuous suppressive fire, the Japanese would maneuver and the casualty rate would accelerate exponentially. Stein had become the linchpin of the company's survival, and he understood this with perfect clarity. The Medal of Honor citation would later credit him with personally killing at least 20 enemy soldiers and destroying multiple fortified positions. But the number that mattered more was 190, the number of Marines who lived through that day because one man refused to let them die. The Japanese soldiers who survived the battle and were later captured spoke of the American with the impossible gun, with a mixture of resentment and reluctant respect. In the Imperial Japanese Army, individual heroism was subordinated to group cohesion, to the collective will of the unit and the emperor. The idea that a single soldier could alter the outcome of a battle through personal action was ideologically suspect, almost offensive. War was supposed to be won through discipline, through unquestioning obedience to orders, through the willingness to die without hesitation when death served the greater cause. But Tony Stein had not subordinated himself to the collective. He had elevated himself above it, not through arrogance, but for necessity. He had seen what needed to be done, and he had done it, regardless of orders, regardless of doctrine, regardless of the risk. This was the American way of war distilled to its essence, not the overwhelming industrial might, not the logistical superiority, but the individual initiative of men who decided for themselves what was worth dying for. The irony was that Stein carried a weapon that embodied American abundance in ways that transcended symbolism. The Stinger was built from salvaged aircraft parts, a testament to the staggering surplus of American military production. By 1945, the United States was manufacturing airplanes faster than the armed forces could use them. Thousands of aircraft sat in storage depots, waiting to be shipped overseas or cannibalized for parts. Stein had taken a weapon system designed for one purpose and repurposed it for another because the resources were simply there, waiting to be used. The Japanese, by contrast, were melting down temple bells to make bullets. Their soldiers went into battle with rifles manufactured in 1905, with swords that dated back to feudal Japan, with bamboo spears when the rifle ammunition ran out. The contrast could not have been more stark. On one side, an army that could afford to strip machine guns from damaged aircraft and mount them on makeshift stocks for individual soldiers. On the other, an army that soldiers were starving to death in their foxholes. But abundance alone did not explain what happened at Hill 362. Plenty of armies throughout history had enjoyed material superiority and still lost battles to more motivated, better-led opponents. What made the difference was the particular American fusion of material resources and individual agency, the belief, embedded so deeply in the culture that it operated at an almost subconscious level, that if the official tools were inadequate, you built your own. That if the standard tactics were not working, you improvised new ones. That if your orders contradicted your understanding of what needed to be done, you did what you knew was right. Tony Stein had learned this worldview not in boot camp, but in Dayton, Ohio, where his father ran a small tool and die shop and taught his son that problems were just machines that had not been properly understood. Every mechanical system could be broken down into components, analyzed, improved. If a part broke, you did not wait for the factory to ship a replacement, you machined a new one. If a tool did not exist for the job you needed to do, you invented it. This was not rebel individualism, it was practical problem-solving elevated to philosophy. The Japanese soldiers defending Hill 362 had been taught a different philosophy. They had been told that the individual was nothing, that only the collective will of the Yamato people mattered, that glory lay in self-annihilation for the emperor's cause. They had been trained to make banzai charges that accomplished nothing except to add their names to casualty lists. They had been ordered to hold positions until the last man died, even when retreat would have allowed them to fight another day. And when they watched Tony Stein make his 8th ammunition run, when they concentrated all their fire on this one stubborn American who refused to die, they must have felt something beyond frustration, perhaps a dawning recognition that they were not fighting an army, but a civilization that played by rules they could not comprehend. By noon on January 23rd, the Japanese defense at Hill 362 had collapsed. The Marines of Company A, having spent 4 hours pinned under withering fire, advanced under cover of Stein's suppression and began systematically clearing bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers. The survivors retreated deeper into Yamashita's defensive network, falling back to the next prepared position in the mountains. Company A counted their casualties: 28 dead, 41 wounded. Without Tony Stein's ammunition runs, without the Stinger's suppressive fire, the butcher's bill would have been catastrophic, perhaps total. Stein himself had fired more than 2,500 rounds in those 4 hours. His shoulder was bloody from the grazing wound, his hands were blistered from the Stinger's superheated barrel guards, his uniform was shredded in a dozen places by near misses. He sat in a foxhole after the fighting ended, methodically cleaning his weapon, checking for stress fractures in the improvised stock, replacing worn parts. Men approached him to shake his hand, to say thank you, to ask in awed voices how he had survived those ammunition runs. Stein offered no philosophizing, no speeches about duty or honor. He simply said, "The gun works better when it has bullets." But Captain Witherspoon recognized what had happened, and he wrote a citation for the Medal of Honor that evening by flashlight, documenting each of the 8 ammunition runs, tallying the enemy positions destroyed, noting the 190 men whose lives had been preserved. The citation worked its way up the chain of command, gathering endorsements from battalion commanders, regimental commanders, finally reaching the desk of General Harry Schmidt, commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps. Schmidt had awarded plenty of medals in his career: Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, Navy Crosses for men who had displayed exceptional courage under fire. But the Medal of Honor was different. The Medal of Honor was reserved for actions that defied rational explanation, for moments when a man transcended his training and his orders and became something larger than himself. Schmidt approved the citation without hesitation. Tony Stein would not live to receive his medal. 3 weeks later, on March 19, 1945, during the battle for Iwo Jima, a different hell, a different island, the same grinding mathematics of survival, Stein was killed by a sniper's bullet while attempting another ammunition run. He was 23 years old. His body was recovered after the position was secured, the Stinger still slung across his back, empty shell casings scattered around his final position like brass pedals. President Harry Truman presented the Medal of Honor to Stein's widow and infant daughter at a White House ceremony in February 1946. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. His relentless fighting spirit and valiant leadership in the face of overwhelming enemy fire were instrumental in saving the lives of his comrades and ultimately securing the objective." But the citation, for all its formal language, could not capture the deeper truth of what had happened in that rice paddy on Luzon. Tony Stein had not simply saved 190 men through courage and marksmanship. He had demonstrated something more fundamental about the nature of warfare in the 20th century, that for all the emphasis on firepower and logistics, on grand strategy and operational art, battles were still ultimately decided by individuals who chose, in moments of extremity, to do the impossible. The Japanese had expected the Americans to fight like Europeans, to advance in coordinated formations, to halt when their supply lines were threatened, to retreat when their casualties exceeded acceptable thresholds. They had built their defensive strategy around these expectations, creating killing zones designed to shatter American cohesion and morale. What they encountered instead were men like Tony Stein, who rewrote the rules in real time, who treated doctrine as suggestion rather than scripture, who looked at a hopeless situation and decided that hope was something you built with your own hands. This was the great asymmetry of the Pacific War, more decisive than any disparity in aircraft carriers or artillery pieces. The Japanese soldier fought to die well. The American soldier fought to live well and bring his brothers home. The Japanese soldier obeyed orders even when those orders guaranteed his death. The American soldier interpreted orders through the lens of mission accomplishment and survival. The Japanese soldier found meaning in annihilation. The American soldier found meaning in problem solving. After the war, military historians studied the battle at Hill 362 as a case study in individual initiative and fire superiority. The Stinger was examined, measured, photographed, and ultimately dismissed as a battlefield expedient unsuitable for mass production. The Marine Corps issued formal guidance discouraging soldiers from modifying their weapons without official authorization. But the lesson that mattered had already been learned by the men who fought alongside Tony Stein, that survival often depended on knowing when to follow orders and when to do what needed to be done. The 190 Marines who walked away from that rice paddy carried Stein's lesson with them for the rest of their lives. Some became teachers, some became factory workers, some became business owners or engineers or fathers who told their sons about the day they almost died on Luzon. They spoke of Tony Stein with reverence usually reserved for saints, and, in a sense, he had performed a kind of secular miracle, the transformation of mechanical precision and individual will into salvation. The Stinger itself survived the war and was eventually donated to the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia, where it rests in a climate-controlled display case alongside Stein's Medal of Honor and a photograph of him grinning at the camera, young and indestructible and utterly unaware of the immortality he would earn in a Philippine rice paddy. Museum visitors pause before the exhibit, reading the placard that describes the weapon's specifications and combat history, trying to reconcile the crude, welded-together machine with the lives it saved. But no placard can explain what Tony Stein understood instinctively, that freedom is not an ideology or a political system, but a posture toward the world, a belief that when confronted with an impossible problem, you do not wait for permission to solve it. You assess, you adapt, you act. You take the pieces of a broken airplane and you forge them into salvation. You run through enemy fire not because you are unafraid, but because fear is simply another variable to be calculated and then overcome. This is the arithmetic of liberty. 1 man, 1 weapon, 8 trips across open ground, 2,500 rounds fired, 40 enemy positions silenced, 190 lives saved. The numbers themselves are almost abstract, sterile in their precision, but each number represented a choice. The choice to reload instead of retreat, to advance instead of take cover, to trust in mechanical reliability and personal skill rather than fate or providence. Tony Stein made those choices 8 times in 4 hours, and each time he survived through a combination of calculated risk and outrageous luck. The Marines watching from the rice paddy believed a little more deeply in the possibility of impossible things. After Luzon, after Iwo Jima, after the atomic bombs fell and the Emperor's voice crackled across Japanese radio announcing surrender, the veterans came home to a country that wanted to remember the war's triumph while forgetting its brutality. They attended Memorial Day ceremonies and 4th of July parades. They joined VFW posts and attended reunions where they drank beer and told sanitized stories. But privately, in quiet moments, they remembered Tony Stein making those ammunition runs, and they understood that they had witnessed something that transcended tactics or strategy, a distillation of everything that made them American. Not the amber waves of grain or purple mountain majesties, not the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Independence, but the simple, radical belief that one person, properly equipped and sufficiently motivated, could change the outcome of history through individual action. That the impossible was just the probable viewed through the lens of insufficient imagination. Tony Stein carried more than ammunition during those 8 runs across the killing ground at Hill 362. He carried the promise that heroism was not the exclusive province of generals and admirals, that salvation could be delivered by a toolmaker from Dayton with a welded-together aircraft gun and a stubborn refusal to let his brothers die. He proved that abundance of resources, of initiative, of sheer American audacity could overcome even the most meticulously prepared defenses when channeled through an individual who understood that doctrine was subordinate to mission accomplishment. The Japanese defenders who survived that day, those who eventually surrendered or were captured as Yamashita's army disintegrated over the following months, carried their own memories of the American with the impossible gun. They told their children and grandchildren about the battle where nothing had gone according to plan, where their superior numbers and fortified positions had been overcome by one man who should have died in the first 30 seconds, but instead made 8 runs and never fell. In their retelling, Stein became something mythological, more ghost than man, immune to bullets and the laws of probability. But Tony Stein was not a ghost. He was a Marine with blistered hands and a bleeding shoulder and an understanding that the distance between life and death could be measured in belt-fed rounds per minute. He was a toolmaker who looked at war as an engineering problem with mechanical solutions. He was a 23-year-old kid from Ohio who decided that 190 lives were more than his own, and then proved it through action. This is what America sent across the Pacific. Not just the ships and planes and endless waves of supplies, but men who had grown up being told that they were the authors of their own destinies, that authority was legitimate insofar as it served the common good, that rules were tools rather than commandments, men who could look at a battle plan and recognize its inadequacy, who could salvage machine guns from wrecked aircraft because the official arsenal was insufficient, who could disobey orders when obedience meant watching friends die. In the end, that was the weapon that won the Pacific War, not the atomic bomb, or the aircraft carrier, or even the magnificent industrial machine that produced 300,000 aircraft and 88,000 tanks and enough ammunition to outlast any conceivable enemy. The real weapon was the culture that created Tony Stein, that taught him to look at an impossible situation and see only an engineering challenge. That gave him permission to improvise, adapt, and overcome. The Stinger now rests behind glass in Virginia, silent and still, its barrel forever cool, its ammunition belts empty. But on a January morning in 1945 in a rice paddy on Luzon, it sang a different song. A rhythmic hammering that measured the distance between despair and salvation in hundredths of a second, between annihilation and survival in trips across open ground, between death and life in the simple, terrible mathematics of one man choosing to reload instead of retreat, again and again and again, until everyone who could be saved had been saved. The rice paddy where Company A nearly died has long since been reclaimed by Filipino farmers. The bunkers have eroded, the foxholes have filled with water and silt. The spent shell casings have been plowed under or collected by scavengers. No monument marks the spot where Tony Stein made his first ammunition run, or his last. The ground remembers nothing. But the men who survived remembered. They went home and raised children and built the post-war world. And when those children asked what the war had been about, what they had fought for, many of them struggled to articulate abstractions like democracy or freedom. Instead, they told stories about a toolmaker from Dayton who built a gun from airplane parts and saved their lives through the simple expedient of refusing to let them die. And in those stories, passed from fathers to sons and daughters, from veterans to historians, from one generation of Americans to the next, the true meaning of Tony Stein's 8 reloads becomes clear. That the measure of a nation is not its wealth or its weapons, but its people's willingness to risk everything for strangers, to improvise solutions when doctrine fails, to recognize that orders and authority are subordinate to the fundamental obligation to preserve life when life can be preserved. This is the inheritance of Hill 362. Not the tactical lessons about suppressive fire or ammunition discipline, but the deeper understanding that freedom is an active verb, a choice renewed with every reload, with every decision to advance when retreat is easier, to stand when falling is safer, to risk one life so that many might endure. Tony Stein made that choice 8 times on a January morning in 1945. He carried ammunition across killing ground because 190 Marines needed him to carry it. He fired the Stinger until its barrel glowed red because silence meant death for men who trusted him. He ignored orders and doctrine and self-preservation because the mathematics were simple. His life in exchange for theirs was not even a trade. It was arithmetic, and the math demanded he reload. And so he reloaded, again and again, while the Japanese concentrated their fire, and the minutes stretched into hours, and the pile of empty shell casings grew until it glittered like brass treasure in the tropical sun. He reloaded until the ammunition ran dry, and then he ran to get more, and then he reloaded again, because that was what the moment required and what his conscience demanded, and what democracy looks like when stripped of rhetoric and reduced to action. This is the lesson of the Stinger, of Tony Stein, of that long morning on Luzon when one man's refusal to accept the inevitable rewrote the mathematics of survival. That freedom is not given but taken, not inherited but earned, not preserved through speeches and ceremonies, but through the willingness of individuals to stand in killing zones and reload, reload, reload until everyone who can be saved walks away alive. The weapon rests now in its case, silent and sacred, a relic of a war that ended 80 years ago. But the spirit that built it, that wielded it, that carried ammunition for it across open ground under enemy fire, that spirit remains the most powerful weapon America ever forged. More decisive than any bomb, more enduring than any empire, more essential than any ideology. It is the spirit of the reload, the recognition that giving up is simply another choice, and that some men, when confronted with that choice, decide instead to find more ammunition and return to the fight as many times as necessary until the job is done and their brothers are safe and the impossible has become merely the difficult. Tony Stein chose the reload. 190 Marines lived because of that choice. And in their living, in their children and grandchildren, in the country they return to build and defend and pass on to the next generation, the echo of that choice resonates still, a reminder that the distance between disaster and deliverance is sometimes nothing more than one man's decision to carry more ammunition, to fire one more burst, and to reload one more time when everyone watching believes that no more reloads are possible. The rifle goes empty, the magazine falls free, a fresh one slides home, the bolt chambers around, the impossible becomes real, one reload at a time.